Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu was born on October 21, 1949, in Tel Aviv, Israel, to a family steeped in Zionist scholarship and activism. His parents were Benjamin Netanyahu, a historian specializing in Jewish intellectual history, particularly the Golden Age of Spanish Jewry, and Sila Segal Netanyahu. His paternal grandfather, Nathan Milekovsky, was a rabbi and Zionist writer. The family adopted the surname Netanyahu, meaning God has given, when his father immigrated to what was then mandatory Palestine. Although born in Israel, Netanyahu spent periods of his childhood in the United States between 1956-58 and again from 1963 until 1967. The family lived in Cheltenham Township, Pennsylvania, where he attended Cheltenham High School. This bicontinental upbringing gave him fluency in English and exposure to both Israeli and American cultures. When the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, Netanyahu returned to Israel to enlist. He served in the Israel Defense Forces (IDF), eventually joining Sayeret Matkal, the elite special forces unit. Among his early military achievements was participating in operations including Operation Isotope in 1972, which involved rescuing hostages from a hijacked airplane. These formative years developed in him a strong sense of security, discipline, and an orientation towards Israeli national defense from a hands-on military perspective. After his active service, Netanyahu pursued higher education, both in Israel and abroad. He studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and later earned a Master of Science in Management Studies (MBA) from the MIT Sloan School of Management. This educational background, combining Israeli academic institutions with U.S. graduate schooling, contributed to his ability to straddle diplomatic, strategic, and political spheres in his later career. After his military and academic sojourn, Netanyahu transitioned into political and diplomatic roles. He first served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and also as the Israeli representative to the United Nations. His early engagement with diplomacy gave him exposure to international forums and Israel's standing globally. In 1993, he was elected leader of the Likud party, marking his rise to the forefront of Israeli right-wing politics. At the time, Israel was deeply engaged in the Oslo peace process, which was controversial and polarized many Israelis. Netanyahu positioned himself as a critic of some aspects of the peace process, particularly concerns over security and recognition of Israel's Jewish character. Netanyahu first became prime minister in 1996, defeating Shimon Peres in a closely contested election. He was the youngest person to hold that office at the time. During his first term, his government focused on economic reforms, privatization, and reducing the deficit. He also made advances in peace negotiations, notably the Hebron and Wye River Memorandum agreements with the Palestinians. However, his tenure was challenged by continuing violence, political opposition, and difficulties in delivering on both peace and security. His first term ended in 1999 when his Likud party lost to Ehud Barak. Among the factors were the public's concerns over peace process stagnation and their expectations for improvement in security and economy. This end of term marked a learning phase for Netanyahu in how Israeli politics, public opinion, and coalition building would work in practice. After leaving office in 1999, Netanyahu spent time both in and out of political roles, often in the opposition. He refined his political strategy, focusing heavily on security issues, foreign policy, and projecting strength. He also worked on Likud's internal dynamics, maintaining influence even when not in power. During this period, Israel went through significant shifts, the Second Intifada, the unraveling of some aspects of the peace process, and rising tensions with neighboring states and non-state actors. In 2009, Netanyahu returned to power. His comeback was built on a platform promising robust security, particularly against Iran's nuclear ambitions, alongside economic stability and more efficient governance. This second long stretch in office would define much of his legacy. When Netanyahu became prime minister again in 2009, he did so under different global and regional conditions. The Arab Spring, emerging threats from non-state actors, and a growing emphasis on Iran's nuclear program reshaped Israel's strategic environment. Netanyahu capitalized on this to assert strong security credentials both domestically and internationally. On the diplomatic front, while there was some qualified support for the idea of a Palestinian state under certain conditions, such as demilitarization and recognition of Israel's Jewish state, the peace process remained largely frozen. Negotiations broke down repeatedly, often over settlement building in the West Bank or issues of recognition. Domestically, Netanyahu faced growing expectations from Israel's middle class, young people, and secular citizens for addressing social issues: housing, education, cost of living. In 2011, for example, large social protests emerged, decrying inequality and high costs across the country. These events indicated that, despite his strong reputation on security, many citizens wanted more on social welfare and economic fairness. Another major dimension of this period is the increasing controversy surrounding Netanyahu's legal issues. Starting in the mid-2010s, investigations began into his relationships with business persons, media outlets, and allegations of fraud, bribery, and breach of trust. In 2016, police investigations intensified. By 2019, formal indictments were announced.
In late 2019, Israel's Attorney General formally charged Netanyahu with several counts: bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He resigned from some ministerial portfolios to avoid conflicts of interest, but remained prime minister while the legal process proceeded. Also during this time, global events like the COVID-19 pandemic presented new challenges. Netanyahu's government was criticized by some for its handling of lockdowns, economic shutdowns, and public health measures, though Israel was among the first nations to implement a large-scale vaccination campaign in 2021. Despite his legal issues, Netanyahu's political acumen enabled him to survive. In 2021, however, a coalition of opposition parties eventually unseated him, and Naftali Bennett, with support from Yair Lapid and others, became prime minister. But this interlude did not last long. By late 2022, Netanyahu had engineered a return to power, winning the election and forming a new government, this time more reliant on far-right and ultra-Orthodox parties. Netanyahu's return to power in late 2022 came with a notably different coalition than his earlier ones. It included far-right elements and parties with controversial positions, especially on judicial reform, relations with the ultra-Orthodox community, and policies toward the Palestinian territories. His agenda during this term has been more polarizing domestically. One of the biggest domestic issues has been proposed changes to the judiciary, including laws that critics say would reduce judicial independence and increase parliamentary control over courts. These proposals triggered large protests within Israel, including from army reservists and civil society, worrying about the separation of powers and democratic norms. Also during this time was the outbreak of war with Hamas following the October 7, 2023 attack. That day, Hamas launched a coordinated offensive into Israel that resulted in large casualties and hostages taken. Netanyahu formed a war cabinet, including bringing in politicians from opposition parties to manage Israel's military and political response. As the war progressed, both international scrutiny and domestic pressure increased, especially over humanitarian concerns in Gaza, the handling of hostages, and the conduct of the Israel Defense Forces. At the same time, Netanyahu has sought to frame the conflict as existential, emphasizing security, deterrence, and restoring order. By mid-2024 and beyond, the war and its aftermath continue to pose serious challenges for Netanyahu's political legitimacy. He also found himself under legal pressure internationally. The International Criminal Court announced intent to seek arrest warrants for him and other leaders over alleged war crimes. Domestically, the coalition's stability, public protests, and military readiness have become ongoing concerns. Benjamin Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister since independence. His impact on Israeli politics, the region, and on the dynamics of Israeli society is deep and complex. On the positive side, supporters point to his strong leadership in security policy, his insistence on Israel being treated as a major strategic actor globally, and his success in sustaining political control in a difficult and shifting regional environment. His handling of Iran's nuclear issue, his cultivation of alliances, and his ability to dominate political debate in Israel are often cited as examples of his political skill. On the other hand, criticisms are substantial. Many criticize his approach to the Palestinian conflict as obdurate, pointing out that peace negotiations have been largely stalled or reversed, settlements have expanded, and the two-state solution has become harder to see in practice. Domestically, allegations of corruption, concerns about weakening democratic institutions, and criticisms of how coalition partners, especially far-right and religious parties, influence policy have provoked strong domestic opposition. Looking ahead, several factors will shape Netanyahu's continuing legacy. 1. Legal outcomes. The resolution, if any, of his ongoing trial in Israel and how that influences his ability to govern and his public legitimacy. 2. War and peace. The course of the Israel-Hamas war, ceasefire possibilities, humanitarian implications, and Israel's relations with its neighbors and new Arab partners. 3. Domestic stability. How Israel addresses its democratic norms and institutions, society's divisions, secular versus religious, left versus right, etc., and whether Netanyahu's coalitions remain stable. 4. Global positioning. Israel's foreign policy under his leadership, especially regarding Iran, relations with the US, and the shifting alliances in the Middle East. In sum, Netanyahu is a figure whose political life has been defined by contrasts: security versus diplomacy, democracy versus centralization, popular support versus deep polarization. His place in history will likely be as a transformative and controversial leader whose decisions will be assessed in light of both their strategic successes and their human, social, and legal costs.